Hi everyone, welcome to Cloud Ranger's Microsoft Azure training. As you know, I'm Sean Ismail. I'm a Microsoft Azure MVP. My contact information is below there. Email, Twitter, blog, LinkedIn, YouTube, and where the slides will be posted. So today is part 3 of Azure's SQL Database, and we are going to talk about database security. So the database security in Microsoft Azure SQL is a little bit different than how you are, or some of you are familiar with the regular SQL database, like the Microsoft SQL Server 2012, 2014, 2016, whatever it is, right? So it gets a little complicated, it's a little hairy, but I'm hoping that through this session, I'm going to make this really simple for you. And when you attempt this yourself, you'll find that it's quite easy. And what I'm going to do is that we're going to have quite a bit of a demo in this session to get you started in this topic. So let's get started. Our agenda for this is that we are going to do this in multiple levels. So the first thing we are going to do is a server level security features exploration, where we'll talk about the server level firewall rules, logins, and master database roles. Then we are going to get to the database level security features, like again, firewall rules, users, and database roles. And if we have time, and I'll try to squeeze that in, we'll talk about some of the schema and object level security features like permissions and things like that on that. So let's get started on the server level security features then. So before we get started, I had some miscellaneous notes over here to just talk about in general and provide some perspective on where we are getting with this. So if you have not watched my previous sessions, please go ahead and do that for the SQL servers, the Azure SQL Server sessions. Once you have done that, you'll figure out that the Microsoft Azure SQL Server is a platform as a service offering in the cloud, right? So when we are talking about security, we are not talking about securing any virtual machines. All right. And the next thing is that Microsoft Azure SQL has a hierarchical security architecture, which is almost similar to Microsoft SQL Server, but a little different. And I'll point those out for you, and we'll take it from there. And there are additional considerations in Azure SQL due to the cloud-based nature. What I mean by that is that uh, this is a platform as a service. It's in the cloud, so accessing those servers, securing these servers are a little different from how it would be on premises in a very controlled environment of yours, right? And we have to also remember that when a SQL server is created in Azure, by default, all access to the SQL databases are restricted by a firewall. And I've showed this briefly in previous sessions in the demos, but I'll go over that once again when we get into the demo for this session. So just to remind you how the database server is accessed in Azure SQL, um, since it's in the cloud, we have to use the whole server's um, you know the entire DNS entry. So over here, as you can see, the logical server, so that's what we call the SQL servers in Azure, is it's a logical server. I named my server Ranger SQL SRV, which is server, whatever, but that's the name of your server .database.windows.net. So you have to use the entire DNS to actually access from your client computer or your client application, wherever. And the port is 1433. And so far, while we are recording this in 2016, close to in fall of 2016, there's no way to change that standard port of 1433. Some of you might be used to doing this in your on-premises environment where you change the port to something else just to make it a little bit more secure for whatever reason. But for now, you can't do that. Okay. So having started with this, let's actually push forward. So the first thing we want to talk about is server level security feature. This is at a server level, not at database level. What you'll find in Azure SQL, you do things at the server level and you do things at the database level. Now we are talking about the server level security features. And the first thing we are going to talk about is firewall. Okay. Once again, just to remind you that we have touched this briefly, but now we are getting into details in this session. So the access to the database server is restricted by IP address of the computer or the device requesting connection. So what happens is that if you want to connect to the server itself to make queries or your client application needs to connect to the database server, there's a firewall. And in our previous demonstrations, we have showed that when you are creating the server, by default, there was a checkbox which you check to let the Azure services connect to your server to actually perform any work on it. Okay, and when we were using the management console to actually manage all of that, we also added our IP addresses. That's what it means, that if you want to access the server, it's in the cloud, you have to whitelist something in there. So by default, all access to databases is restricted through firewall rules. So you are going to have the firewall rules, which by default, like I mentioned, will not allow any connections when you start off. Okay, connection originating from Azure are allowed. So this is something we, like I mentioned, we have seen before, that when you are creating the server, we're putting that checkbox, which actually allows Azure to connect to the server to do anything. And like I put in the parenthesis over there, that optionally can be disabled. So you can also choose not to not to allow Azure to do anything on that server, right? The next thing is that explicit firewall rules are required for systems, public IP addresses. That's what I mean, to allow access to the database. So what happens is that since this is in the cloud, anywhere you are connecting from, let that be an application, let that be like, Management Studio where you will run a query, it does not matter from where you access the SQL server on Azure, you have to whitelist your IP address you're connecting from. So basically the public IP address that you will be connecting from has to be whitelisted. Okay, without doing that, we are not going to get any access to the database. And that's what I mean by whitelisting anyways. And the next thing is firewall configuration can be done from the portal, the PowerShell, or TSQL or Transact SQL. So that's what Microsoft calls it, SQL, right? Transact SQL. So you can make the firewall changes, add, remove, whitelist, all from those places. The next thing is the firewall rules are stored in a master database. So every time you create your server and you are creating databases on that server, the minute you create the server, a master database is created before you even create other databases. That master database holds all the information about the server and the rules, logins, users, whatever you need to connect to that master database. Whatever you need to do on the server is stored basically there. Like what can this server do, the properties and things like that. And there are ways to actually see how you're going to access those firewall rules. Like I'll show this in a demo on how to go and check what firewall rules are already there on the server when we get started, or when we add anybody on the any public IP addresses on that database server. I'll show you that when we do the demo. So before we actually jump into anything, let's actually go and explore some of this, right? So this is the this is the portal. This is my portal, and basically what I did is I went and created a SQL server already to save some time. It's called Ranger SQL SRV. Okay, and in this server, I haven't done anything special. It's just out of the box creating a database. If you do not know how to do this, watch my previous sessions on how to create a server. And the server that we create over here is basically called a logical server, right? This is called a logical server. And what I also did in there is create a SQL database. This is a database I created. And when I created the database, I actually asked for sample data. So this is not a blank database. It actually came with Microsoft sample databases. To follow along these demonstrations, please go ahead and do this too as well. The create a server, create a database, and make sure when you're creating the database, you actually drop down and rather than a blank database, have a sample database in there. I think it was AdventureWorks something that I chose. Anyways, so let's actually go to the server to Ranger SQL SRV. And I just want to show you the firewall things going on here right now. So since I haven't done anything in here, if you go to the firewall tab over here, you'll see that there are no firewall rules configured. Okay, but as I mentioned before in my previous session, that it actually quite conveniently shows your public IP address that you're connecting from, right? So I'm connecting from my home lab, and what's happening is that it's giving my public IP address to connect to. Okay, and this is what I meant before, that allow access to Azure services. This is on over here because when we were creating the database, we checked that box that said allow access to Azure services. So all I want to show you right now is that since I do not have any rules configured, because when you create a new server, it denies everything. If I try to connect to this SQL server from my lab computer, which I'm running from, it's going to be denied. So let's go ahead and go to SQL Server Management Studio. And what we need to do is go to, let's see over here, go to Overview, actually go to properties. This is the name of the server, right? I mean, this is what you need to connect to. So copy that. I most likely already have that here. Uh, it's opening twice. Anyways, so I already have there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect with the admin user that I created when I was creating the server. So this user is usually required, or this login, that's what it's called. This login is usually created. Um, it's almost mandatory when you're creating the server. Okay, so let's go ahead and put my password in there, and I'm going to log in. As you can see, it's not going to let me log in. It's giving me an option to actually sign in to my Azure and add my client IP addresses. This is basically the same way you would whitelist your IP address. So there is a good way, I mean, it's a convenient way of signing in to Azure subscription, finding that server and adding that over there. But I'm going to do this a little bit more precisely or a little bit more organized way how we are supposed to do it. Okay, so let's go ahead and say that I'm going to add this IP address over here. So what I'm going to call this is like home IP. And since it already gave me this IP address, I'm going to take that. I'm going to say start IP is this one, and the end IP is this one as well, which means that this is not a range. This is just a single IP address, okay? And that's it. It's done. So let's go ahead and save this, and it's successfully saved as well. So if we try to do this once again with our admin login, we should be able to get in without any issues. So let's go ahead and do that. Cool. As you can see that we have logged in already to our logged into our SQL logical SQL server. The databases, there should be like a system database, the master database that you will always have even the first time you actually create this logical server. I actually have a second one that I created and I showed you guys from here that I actually went and created another database over here. You can just do add and add another database, but it's already here and it can obviously explore it, right? So that's cool. Now, let's see. If we go to our master database here, I'm going to do something which is going to be a new query. So right click on the master database and make a new query. You have to make sure that you are connected to the master database, right? To make this query. And what was the query over here? Select a star. So we're going to take this and just we're going to take this and we are going to uh, run this query on master database and see what happens. Okay, we should be able to see all the firewall rules that are currently there. So let's come over here. We'll do select star from sys firewall underscore rules. So basically what's happening over here is that this is a view. This is not a database. This is actually a view. So what it's doing is that it's showing us that these are the firewall rules your server has. And we can see that quite clearly from here, right? So this is one interesting way of finding out what firewall rules are there. You can always come over here to the server and look it up from here as well. The reason I'm showing you that through a query is just to tell you that this is actually stored in the database itself. Okay, so this information is stored in the master database when you're creating the server. All right, cool. So that was about the firewall over there. You can actually add firewall rules, remove firewall rules from there without any issues, and I think it should be pretty straightforward. Just to remind you once again that this was a firewall rule that was at a server level, okay, to access the server. We haven't done anything with the databases yet except exploring the master database where we ran this query to see what the firewall rules are, okay? So now let's move on to the next server level security feature, which is the logins, okay? So this is quite important, so just hear me out. So logins are used at server level to authenticate connection to the SQL server. So what this logins will do, like you saw that I created a login called Sean, what this login was doing is basically it's a username just to connect to the server. And that's it. Traditionally, this is a SQL Server authentication. So there is no support for Windows integrated authentication. It's just SQL Server authentication. Okay. Since version 12, by the way, V12 is actually like SQL Server 2016. So if we say on-premise server 2016, that's what V12 means on Azure. Okay. You can actually use Azure AD authentication as well. No integrated Windows authentication, but you can use SQL and Azure AD authentication. The first login, or it's called a database subscriber account, is created when the SQL Server is provisioned. So when I first created that logical SQL Server, or when you will create that, it will actually ask you for a username and password. My username was Sean, right? So this becomes your admin account. So this is the admin of the SQL Server instance, and you can only have one account of this type, which is like a root account or admin account, which has access to everything. Any database that you create in the future, this account will also have access to it. So it's similar to the SA account on the on-premise server. Actually, very much like the SA is the root account. It can do everything. Permission of this account cannot be restricted. That's what I mean. Like you cannot create a database and be like, hey, I'm going to block this first login or this database subscriber account. You can't. Okay. Logins are defined in the master database, so this should not come across as a surprise to you that anything related to the server is actually stored in the master database, which comes with the server, right? So logins are defined in there. Basically, it means it's stored in there. And logins automatically do not provide access to databases. So the first login that you had created, in my instance, this was Sean, it has access to everything. But any subsequent logins that I will create, it will not have access to all the other databases. And I'll show this as a part of demonstration when we create one. Okay. And I have put for your convenience the couple of queries in there that we'll be using in these demonstrations. So basically, you can just take them from here, copy and paste from the slides, and you can follow along yourself as well. So let's go ahead and actually do this. What we are going to do is first, as you can see from here, that we are going to query a table called sys.sql_logins. This will show us all the logins that are there today on the SQL Server. Okay, then we're going to create a login called Ranger1, and we'll give this password to that. And we'll also delete that, but after a couple of tests, then we'll drop it or we'll delete that login. Okay, so let's go to our demo and see that real quick. So once we come over here, this is where we were. I actually phrased this. So under the security over here, you'll see that there's something called as logins. In the logins, there's only one user right now. This is the user that we created when we are creating, we added, how do you put it? This is the user that was created when the server was created, okay? And this is mandatory. You have to have one user to do that. So the first thing we wanted to do was actually see all the other logins that are there. So one way is this. By the way, we'll continue from it has to be a query to the master database. We know that this window that's opened is querying the master database. If you actually do it, pop it over here, you can see Ranger SQL Server, .NET, Windows.NET, .master. So you know that this is actually querying the master database, okay? So let's go ahead and run that query to find out, what are the users that are there, or what are the logins that are there through Transact SQL. Okay, just give me a moment here. Let me grab that info. Okay, select a star from sys.sql_logins. So highlight this. Don't go and run the execute because it will execute all of them together. So highlight this because I just want to run this query and do execute. So right now, as you can see, it shows exactly what I have over here. It just has one login. So let's go ahead and actually create one login, okay? So the way you can create a login is you can right click on the login over here and do new login. And what it'll do is that it will give you the Transact SQL to actually create a login. So what we said in what we had on our slide is that we are going to create a login called Ranger1. So let's go ahead and create a login called Ranger1. And we gave it the password, if I'm not mistaken, was, let me remember, password, P, just give me 1 second. If I can get the focus here. Okay, P add. What am I doing here? That's it. So that's all we have to do to create a login. So command completed successfully. So come over here to the login, do a refresh, and we should see Ranger 1 was a login that was created. So what did I mention these logins were used for? They were actually used for connecting to the server. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and actually open up a new uh, server management studio, and I'm going to try to connect with that user to this one. Okay, so by default, as you can see, I actually have this because I tried this before. I'm going to check something here really quick. I'm going to go to default. You probably don't have to do that. Default will make sure that you're actually connected to that server directly. I'm going to go ahead and put the password. This is actually not going to work, and I'm going to tell you why. Okay, so we do have a login, and we do have the right IP address because it's the same client computer I'm connecting from. But if you look at this error, it will tell you what the issue is. The server principal, which basically means the user or the login, Ranger 1, is not able to access the database master under the current security context. Okay, so it is trying to connect, it's establishing the connection, but it does not have access to the master database. Okay, I'll get to that later when we go to the other slides where we talk about users. But I just wanted to show you that this is how you should be creating um, a login. Okay, and deleting the login is pretty easy over here. You can pretty much just go ahead and say delete. It will ask you that, hey, if we can delete this, and you can say yeah. And it just says deleting server logins. Do not delete the database users. Don't worry about it. That should be it. And voila, it's gone. Okay, but I do need this user, so I'm going to just go ahead and create it again and keep it for the next few slides. Okay, so Ranger 1, let's keep it there. Now let's move on. Before I actually get out of this slide over here, I actually want to show you that there's that the transact SQL that will also drop that user or delete that user. I just right clicked and deleted it, but you could have done this from here as well, right? So I wanted to show you over there. So we have done firewalls and we have done logins. These are the server level security features. There's one more based on our agenda, and this is this slide. The server level security features database roles. Okay, this is where the mystery is, that why our login that we created, Ranger 1, was not able to log in. The mystery lies over here. Okay, but we are not going to go through this slide yet. I know it's a little confusing, but we're not going to go through the slides yet. I'm going to move on and I'm going to come back to this slide and we'll get into the details. Okay, let's leave this slide like this for now, and I'll explain in a bit why. So far, if we actually scroll back, we have been talking about server level security features, but now we are moving on to database level security features. And the first thing we want to talk about is users. Okay, so like I mentioned over my slide, so far what we have created is a login. That Ranger 1 was a login. Okay, it was not a user. Remember that because there's going to be there are huge differences between those two things when you come to Azure SQL. And this is where it gets a little tricky between your on-premise SQL Server and Azure SQL Server. Okay, so what does users do at a database level security feature? It provides additional security at the database level. Okay, so um, just remember it as that for now. Logins automatically do not provide access to the databases. And we have seen that just now, that we created a login and we were trying to connect to the default, database, which is the master database. It actually threw us that error that said that it did not have access to the master database. Okay, which perfectly makes sense now that you know this, that creating logins do not create the users for the database. So how do you do that? Users should be explicitly created for each database, and then logins should be mapped to the user during creation. So this sounds like a mouthful and very confusing. But what it's trying to tell you is that you created a login, then you have to go to the database and create a user. And when you create this user, you have to map it to the login to make sure that they both are connected. So like I created Ranger 1 as a login, I need to go to the master database and create a user called Ranger 1 and map them to. Once that's done, that means that I have full access to it. There's a big reason Azure SQL Database is done like that, and I'll come to that in a bit. But you have to remember, there's a login and there's a user. Login is at the server level, user is at the database level, okay? User should be provided roles on the database. So just creating that user and mapping to a login for the database is not going to work. You need to provide it some roles. And system admin logins is mapped to DBO user in all databases. Just hold on to the thought on that one. Once we did some mapping, created a login and created a user, I'll come back to this one, that what it means by system admin login is mapped to DBO user in all databases. So for your convenience, once again, what I have done is I have put the script in the slide over here that we are going to use. That this one is, I think this one I was trying to do is to solve the problem that we had with Ranger 1, and this is one I have done for the database, and I'll come to this one in a bit. So just take the slide, pause it over here, or just copy and paste it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the same thing, go to the go to my SQL Management Studio and show you what we are trying to do here. So the first thing I'm going to do over here is solve my problem. Why is Ranger 1 not able to connect to my master database or just bring up anything over here? So based on the conversation we just had, I told you logins were created at the server level. Now we have to create users at the database level. So our biggest problem is with the master database, right? So we're going to go to the master database. I know this is where the connection to the master database was. Okay, shows dot master at the end. Perfect. So what I'm going to do over here is come over here, go expand the master database, go to security, go to users. And as you can see in the users, if I refresh once again, that there's nobody called Ranger 1 here. Means Ranger 1 as an user does not have access to the master database. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Remember, logins are for servers and users are for the databases themselves. So let's go ahead and create a new user. So when I highlight on this and do a new user, it's in the context of a master database. So it's master database. All right, let's go ahead and create a user. So we want to create a user and give it the same name because that's the easiest way to remember. But here's where the confusion is. Ideally, I would do Ranger 1, but technically you can actually do Ranger whatever, okay? The catch is that when you are creating this user, you need to map it for the login. So create user for login. This is what mapping means. And we know there's a login already called Ranger1. So I'm going to create a user Ranger1 for a login called Ranger1 as well. Okay. And with the default schema, I'm going to just put it as a DBO. So this is the database owner. And that should pretty much do it. Okay. So what did we do? For the database, we created a user, mapped it to the login Ranger1, and that's it. So let's go ahead, highlight that, and bam, just like that, we should have the Ranger1 user here. Okay, so what we did right now is we created the login, we created the user. Let's find out what's happening here now. So Ranger1, let's drop the, so Ranger1, this is the password. Let's see what happens now. Okay, so we were able to log in, right? We can see the databases. We can see the master database, the one we were interested in. And we can actually see the Ranger database over here as well. Okay. But a couple of things are different in this console, if you remember. If you come over here, let's look at this. This is the server. We have databases and we have security. But this is what we logged in as right now with Ranger 1. We only see the databases and we don't see the security or anything like that. And the reason behind that is, oops, and the reason behind that is there's the other thing we missed, which is that every user that you create for your database has to be added to a role. Okay? Right now, the user Ranger 1 does not have any roles. So based on the script that we had, what we are going to do is we are going to add some roles to that. So I guess when we are creating this user, it actually did the sp add role member for whatever. Okay? So this is where I want to go back to the slide for the, I want to go back to the slide that we had created over here as the server level security features and talk about the database roles. So there are multiple database roles. For the master database roles, there are two specific roles in Azure SQL databases that you should be interested in. One is the login manager role, and one is the DB manager role. So when you create that user and map it to the login and for the master database, we can add it to the login manager role, means it will give the user permission to create and manage other logins. So Ranger 1 will be able to create other logins for other people. And the other role you can add it to is the DB manager role, means that Ranger 1 will be able to create and manage other databases. Okay? Users are assigned to database roles, not logins. This is just a reminder that users are always at a database level. So we can use this script that I have over here. I've kept that for you to actually go and do that for you. So let's see, sp add role member. So I'm executing a stored procedure. I'm not going to get into details on what a stored procedure is. If you don't know that, it's something SQL people, I mean, you guys totally know what it is. But just remember that this is a stored procedure and I'm just executing that. And what I'm going to say over here is that I'm going to put DB manager. So this is the role I want, or actually I'm going to do the login manager first. So that means I want Ranger 1, as you can see over here, Ranger 1 does not have access to logins. So I want Ranger 1 to actually have access to logins like this to add and create. Okay. For who? For Ranger 1. So I'm going to come over here and do Ranger 1. So let's go and execute that. If I come over here and refresh this right now, I should now see the logins show up here. And the reason behind that, the security and the login showing up here, because now what I'm saying is that, hey, Ranger 1, you are part of the master database, you are a user there, and now I have given you some roles. And one of the role is login manager, means you can now add or delete new logins yourself as well, just like how Sean could do it over here. Now, the other thing we want to do is also give it permissions to, add databases. Like, if this Ranger 1 wants to create databases on its own. So one of the role was login manager. The other one was what? The other one was DB manager, means database manager. Okay, you can do that as well. And what it will do is I'm not going to get into that, but it should be able to create databases by itself now as well. So Ranger 1 kind of is now like the user Sean, but not completely. Okay. Going back over here, I mentioned one thing in the slide over here that we will talk about in a bit. System admin login is mapped to DBO users in the database. What does that mean? So when I created the Ranger 1, the user that I created was also called Ranger 1. And this is what it does. Create user Ranger 1 for login Ranger 1. But like I said, this user could have been anybody. It just has to map to the login. It does not actually have to be, it does not have to have the same name. So basically, when Sean was created, okay, Sean was created over here. I can go to Ranger DB1, go to security. This is a database that I created. You can see over here that there's no Sean in here. This is a custom database I created. Because what's happening is that perhaps when Sean was being created, it looked like this. Okay. So a user DBO was created and it was mapped to the login Sean. That's why whenever a new database will be created, you'll always see a DBO user, and Sean will always have access. This login, Sean will always have access to it. And you keep wondering that I don't see Sean in here. Well, actually, it's the user's name is DBO. It's mapped to the login Sean. And that's what actually that slide, what it was meant, that the system admin login is mapped to the DBO users in all databases. So if you create a database, maybe, your name is Harry or Joe, whatever. When you create your user, it will also create, when you create your login, it will also create the DBO user in all databases for you. Okay, so that's what it really means. Now, let's go back to a lab computer here. I want to do a couple of things. So I've shown you what login is at the server level, what user is at the database level, how to map them, how to give them some roles, and things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and now get rid of all of that, because I want to go and do some real scenarios, not really play with the master database, but play with the actual database and run some queries, okay, like the Ranger DB one. So what we can do is we can totally come over here and delete this user. Okay. Deleting this user does not, from master, does not mean that the login is going to be deleted. See, the login is still there. So I'm going to delete this login as well. Okay, fine. Okay, so there's no trace of Ranger 1 anywhere. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a new login. So come over here. This one was connected to the master database. Yep, this was connected to the master database. I'm going to create Ranger 1 login again. Okay, let's actually close this one because technically Ranger 1 should not be able to access that right now. So what happened here? Right now, I have just the login Ranger 1. We know if we try to connect right now, we should not be able to connect because it does not have access to master database. Okay. Come on. Perfect. Perfect. Actually, this keeps defaulting to different database. It should be default server. I want to show you actually the actual server. Okay, perfect. It's actually saying the Ranger 1 is not able to access the database master. So this is back to square one. We know why this is not connecting right now. It's failing because the user is not created for master and this login Ranger 1 is not mapped. Great. But we don't want to do that this time. What we want to do is actually create the user for the database or the sample database that I had created here. Okay. And this is what you most of the times you will be doing. You're actually creating a database most likely in your organization for an application to access or whatever, right? So if I come over here, as you can see, the user is empty. There's nobody there. So let's do this. Right click on Ranger DB1. Actually, let me close this one so we don't make any mistakes here. I'm going to actually, nah, I don't need that. Let's actually close this. Oh, this is the one I had to actually show the firewalls. Okay, you know what? Since I'm already here, I'm going to close that. I'm going to show that if you run the selected star, it should actually show me both Sean and Ranger 1 right now as expected from here. Cool. So I'm going to close that as well. Okay. So I'm going to create a user for Ranger DB1 for the Ranger 1 user. Okay. So let's go to security. Let's go to users, new user. This is now in the context of what? This is on the context of Ranger DB1, not the master. So we know that this is actually going to create in Ranger DB1. Let's come over here, Ranger 1. I'm going to create it for this user for the login and map it, Ranger 1. I'm going to give it DBO as well, DBO. And let's leave it like that for now. Execute that. If I refresh this, what's going to happen? Ranger 1. Okay, so Ranger 1 user now has been created for the Ranger DB1, and Ranger 1 is mapped to login Ranger 1. So let's go ahead over here and try to log in right now. I'm still going to get an error. Okay, so this is what it means by database level security. Our IP address is whitelisted, our login has been created, our user has been created for the Ranger DB1 and mapped to the login. Okay, this error by default is actually showing that Ranger 1 is not able to access the database master. It's actually looking for the default database or the master database access when you try to log in. And this was the issue I kept jumping before, but this is how you do it. Go to options. You can see connect to database is default. Default means master. What you need to do is actually go and type in, this showed up because I tried this before, but you want to type in the name of the database you want to connect to through this user. We know Ranger 1 is an user to Ranger DB1. So what you need to do is you need to say that, hey, I want to connect to the server, yes, but I want to actually connect to the database, only the database Ranger DB1. Okay, so let's go ahead and do a login, and we should see that that should not be a problem. Okay, so let's go to databases here, and we should see the Ranger DB over here. We will see master over here too, but we don't have access to that directly to log into. But Ranger DB1 is here. So what I have done in the back end is I've created, like I said, that when this database Ranger DB1 was being created, I actually put a sample database there, right? If you do not know what I mean over here, come to the SQL database. When you try to create a new database over here, you can see that it gives you an option to create a blank database or a sample database. Like say select source. I actually selected a sample database. So Microsoft includes a database called AdventureWorks, um, which actually has some data in there for you to play with. And the one that I was using was a sample database. And in the sample database, I was using version 12. Okay, there are two options over here. Take the version 12. So I'm not going to create that because I already did, but that's how I created Ranger DB1. Okay, so this actually has a bunch of tables. There is sample data in there. So if you see, system tables or external tables, sorry, what am I doing here? Actually, no, it's interesting that I came over here. As you can see, it does not have any, it's not seeing any tables in there, but there are actually tables in here. I know that because there's a sample database in there. Okay. Can anyone just pause for a moment and think why I'm not seeing any tables or anything over here? Okay. If you have thought about this properly, what is the step that we are missing? We have created the login. We have created the user. Firewall rules are there. We know that. What we have not done is we have not given it this user any role. Like, what is this user going to do? Like, is it going to read? Is it going to write? We don't know that, okay? So we are going to give this user a role called, let's say, DB owner, means the owner of the entire database, okay? If we don't do that, the first thing you'll see is that it's not seeing any tables, means it's not seeing any data. And the other thing I have done is I've created a small PowerShell script that actually queries a bunch of table and actually shows some data. Okay, so let's go to my PowerShell, and I'll put this in one of the slides so you don't have to like do anything. You don't have to try to copy this from here. I'm going to log into my account, add Azure RM account, and just copy and paste this entire thing over here. Obviously, you're going to put your own database name here, the server instance. This is my server instance. Put the one that you have created, the login that you have created, and the password. And this query should be the same for you if you created the database with the sample adventure works that I was talking about. Okay, so you should be able to query this through PowerShell. I just created this for showing that this PowerShell is now my client to query that. That's why I created that. You could have taken this query just by itself, come over here and run a query on the database here. Okay, it should show similar results. And you know what? Maybe I'll do that. So just give me 1 second here. It's catching up. But let's see this over here. If I try to run this, what happens? So it's actually telling me the select permission was denied on the object customer database ranger db1. So I was trying to actually run this query, select first name, company name from customer table. Obviously, I cannot even see that table. When I run this query, it's actually telling me you don't have permissions. You might have a login, you might have a mapped user, but you don't have a role on this database yet. Okay, so if we come over here, and this one is actually acting up, let's come over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and actually give this a role. And the role is going to be DB owner. This is one of the database owner roles, or this is the database role, and it's going to be for the user ranger1. Okay, so I'm executing this stored procedure that says that I want you to be an owner of this database. It says it's completed successfully. This guy's still acting up. I probably might have to close this one. But if I come over here and run this again, as you can see, it actually was successful in running this query. Okay, it took the first name of the person and it showed the company name. Okay, so it's a sample database. It has a bunch of random data in there. So, but what I'm trying to show over here is that now Ranger 1 actually has a role on the database, as a full role on the database, and it can actually query databases. Okay, which is pretty cool. Let me actually run this. When you're running the management studio, you have to actually make sure that just because we took away the master database thing, we need to make sure that this is actually connecting not to the default one, but the database you give the user access to, okay? It's very important. Otherwise, you will have a lot of frustration if you're not going to do that, trying to figure out, hey, what's wrong? Well, what's wrong is that you're trying to log into the wrong database you don't have access to. You only have access to this database. So if we come to the tables right now, you can actually see that you can see the tables. And the reason you can see the tables is because now we have added that role, the owner role. Basically, it can do anything on this database right now. Okay, there's multiple roles, and my slides will show that for you. So you can actually, let's see, it's freezing a little bit, but let's come over here. You know, we keep running this, we'll always see this. Okay, let's go back over here, and what I wanted to show is we can actually take that role away as well. So if you take this stored procedure, there's another stored procedure in there. And I think I had that in the slide. What I'm going to do is instead of add role member, I'm going to drop or delete. In SQL, drop means mostly delete. And I'm saying that, hey, I'm going to take away that role from you. So I'm not deleting the user, I'm not deleting the login, I'm just taking that role away. So technically that means when I come over here, let's clear this. If I go and click on this, it basically will fail again because it does not have access. Okay, once again proving that that was the issue. So if I give the role back again, I run this, should be working just fine. Okay, looks like this thing kicked me out. Let's try this. Okay, never mind. Cool. So let's go back over here. Have we missed anything? No. We have created the login, we have mapped it to created the user, mapped it, and we have did everything over here. Cool. All right, so let's go back to the slides. So this is where we were. All the queries that we were doing over here is over here on the slide. So you can just copy it from here, SB add role mobile. So one thing I'm noticing is that in Azure documentation, most of the places, they're not using these stored procedures for adding and removing the roles to the database. They're using something called as alter role, login manager, add member, or drop member. So they're using this query, alter role. Okay, so if you see this one in your exam or you see that in any other references, this is pretty much the same way of running this stored procedure, but essentially alter role will do the same thing as adding and removing roles to your databases. Okay, so this was once again a database level security. Okay, adding the users in there. Moving on. So the one that I was using was DB owner. So for your exam, as well as for all practical purposes, you have to remember these are all the other roles that are there. Okay. For the purpose of this demonstration, I gave DV owner role to that user ranger one. You probably don't want to do that in your production environment. You want to do something a little bit more specific. Like you probably want to just give it a data reader. Means this user is not going to do anything except reading data, which we were kind of doing right now. I could have easily gotten away with DB underscore data reader as one of the roles. That hey, you know, I don't need to give this user so much power because I'm not going to let it do anything else, right? So this is one good way, and I will get to uh, the details now that why it matters to make uh, the user at a database level rather than you know having it at a master level or putting it in the master database. So what Azure SQL over here is trying to do is saying that, hey, you can have multiple logins to a server, but anytime you want to access a database, you need to create a user and manage that separately. What it will do is that your same SQL server can have multiple databases and it can have multiple users to get there. So one user cannot essentially, see or do anything to the other databases. This is actually quite elementary. It's actually more simple because we have been doing the same thing on SQL servers all the time. It's just that how we were creating a new user and mapping it to the login part is the different part. Okay, so that's why they are calling it a database level security feature. It's not a server level security feature because this user is created at the database level. Okay, that's all you have to remember. So I know I'm repeating myself, but just to review, at the server level, you create the login. At the database level, you create the user, and in the database level, when you're creating the user, you need to map it to the login. Okay, and that's how you have uh, the login and the user done. Once the user is created, you need to make sure this user has a role because this user needs to do something to the database. It either can be owner or all the roles that you're seeing on the slides right now. It can do all of that. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Now, this will be an interesting one. Database level security features, firewalls. You're probably wondering, Sean, hold on a second. Just a couple of slides ago, we did a firewall. That was a server level security feature. What is this database level security feature firewall? Like I mentioned, this is now Azure SQL in a cloud environment. There are a lot of other considerations that you have to take when you're in a cloud environment and trying to do all this kind of stuff, right? What Azure did is said that, hey, we know that you can have a firewall at the server level. Means technically anywhere from my lab computer, because that was my IP address that I put in the server level that you all viewed, I should be able to connect. What if? And I should be able to connect and see all the databases, right? All the databases. If I'm logging with the admin account, I should be able to see everything. But what if there are multiple databases in there and I should not see them or I should not be able to do anything over there just because let it be multiple tenants or multiple applications which are located and running from different other places or other data centers. So what Azure did is they have another level of firewall at the database level. Just how we did the user, there is another one in the database level. So if we go back to the portal here and go back to the server, the thing that you're seeing here is a server level firewall. Okay, so if you go to the firewall over here, this is a server level firewall. Any application running in my home lab right now, since this is my public IP address, will get through. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to close everything here, all these clients. Okay, I'll let this one be. I'll just clear the screen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this role. So I'm going back to square one. When the server was created, there was no firewall rules configured. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go and demonstrate this once again, that I'm going to go open up the management studio and we should not have access to this database, any database actually. So Ranger 1 was trying to connect to Ranger DB1. Fine, let's try with that. Should not have access. Error connecting to this. The client address is not allowed to access the server. Great. We knew that this is not going to happen because the server level is not there. So what we need to do is we actually need to, or I'm going to demonstrate to you how to do this at a how to do this at a database level. So the very first time, I obviously need to actually add this back because I need to actually get in there to modify this. Now this is the bad news. Server level firewall can be added from here, my home, and I'm going to put this over here. You know that this is going to allow us because we have just done this like not too long ago. This is perfectly working. Database level firewalls cannot be done with the portal. It has to be done through Transact SQL. Okay, so that's the not so good part about it. But it's easy to remember, it's easy to memorize, so you should not have too much of an issue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually log in with my admin user, and I'm going to log into the master database, so which is the default database. I'm going to connect to it, and obviously it's going to let me through because I just added myself back in. The only reason I added myself back in is to actually just, add the firewall at the database level. So just to go back to the slides, I want to let you know the firewall rules set directly on the database. Okay, this is in addition to the database server, and you can actually run a query just like we ran last time to see the databases on the firewall rules on the server. This is actually firewall rules on the database. So the previous query was select star from sys.firewall underscore rules. This is actually database underscore firewall underscore rules. Means it's at the database level. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go here and I'm going to actually go to my master database. Actually, forget the master database. Let's actually go to my custom database and run a new query here. The first query that I'm going to do is select star from, this is what we did earlier, sys.firewall underscore rules. We know when we run this, these are the select star from sys.firewall underscore rules. Actually, the reason this is not going to work is because this is not at a master database. This was this one, right? So at the master database, let's actually open a new query here because, like I mentioned, everything is stored at the master database level for the server itself. So we should be able to see that my home. This is the server level. At the database level, forget this over here. This is what database? This is Ranger DB1, as you can see over here. I'm going to run that query. Select star from, this time it's going to be sys dot, this is a database level, so database underscore firewall underscore rules. Okay, at the database level, and this is at the database level Ranger DB1, this is query Ranger DB1. Let's run this. We should see there's no rule there. Okay, so by default there is no rule that's allowing to this specific database. So what we are going to do is we're going to come over here and we're going to have, let me go ahead and get that for me. Copy. Let's paste this here. What I'm going to do is add a database level firewall rule. And I'm going to have the same IP address. So I'm going to run the stored procedure sp set database firewall rule, execute that. I'm going to name it Ranger DB1 firewall rule because this is for this database. You can name anything. And this is the range. For the range, it's similar to my IP address. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. Execute. One row is affected. So that means if I run this query now, it should say my database has one specific role. Okay, my database has a firewall rule. Okay, this is still different from the firewall rule for my servers that's stored in the master database. My master database. This is a database level and it's stored in Ranger DB1. Great. So I'm going to do something interesting right now. I'm going to go ahead and delete this rule over here. Save it. So technically, I do not have a firewall rule to my server anymore. I'm going to close this right now. Previously, when we tried to open this over here, we are getting that error that, hey, there's no problem. If I have done everything correctly, and if I try to log in with Ranger1 to Ranger DB1, so Ranger1 to Ranger DB1, I should not have a problem. And as expected, I do not. Okay? And I'm actually seeing Ranger DB1 here properly without any issues. So what just happened here is that I actually went on a secondary level. And what I did is that I went and created a database, Ranger DB1, and what I did was created a firewall rule just for this database itself. So one of the questions could be that why do we need to do this? Well, think about it this way. You have multiple databases accessed by multiple applications which reside in different locations. One could be on premises, one could be on a virtual machine somewhere, one could be like a Azure web app, another PaaS service which is connected somewhere. You just want to have that extra layer of protection saying that, hey, even if I'm not going to give you, I'm not going to give you an access from a server level, but I'm going to give each of these logins or these users access to this database from specific IP addresses which are located in other locations. Okay, so this is an extra layer of protection to make sure that you know uh, the databases are not compromised. And in a cloud environment, you have to be, since there's a public endpoint, you have to be that secure. You have to make sure that only the applications residing at a certain place has access to the database. The database it requires. An application does not, first of all, need access to all the databases except the ones it requires, and the ones it requires should have that IP address. Okay, and sometimes, and this is more important, this might be required for some compliancy. If you're going through a certification process, compliancy in your organization for any specific program or a project, this is very important as well. Okay, to make sure that specific IP addresses are used, and this definitely helps quite a bit. So let's go back to our slides really quick over here. So over here, the firewall levels, I just wanted to make sure. So this is how you check the firewall rules. This is how you add the IP addresses, and you can actually remove those firewall rules with sp delete database firewall rule. Execute this stored procedure. Okay, it should be pretty simple as well. So we're almost towards the end. I think I'm going to wrap up this. It's almost towards the hour, so I'm going to wrap up this session over here saying that, hey, this is the PowerShell script that I was using to run those tests. This is almost simulating an application. You could actually take that step and write an application somewhere or use a web app or anything to connect to your sample database and bring that all. Okay. The little note over here that make sure the sample database was created for the query to work means that when you are creating the database, make sure that you are choosing not a blank database, but that AdventureWorks as the database, sample database. So you can actually follow along this session and do all of this. So we did quite a bit in this session. We went over Azure SQL database security at a server level and at a database level. At the server level, we saw the firewalls, we saw what a login is, and we saw the master database, different database roles at the master database level. At the database level security, we saw users and we also saw firewalls and we saw various, database roles that can be there for a database. And depending on always the least privilege system, right? I mean, you always want to make sure that you're providing as less privilege as possible, no more than it's required. And yeah, that's pretty much it. There is one last part. There is object level permissions that we really did not get to. But what it basically means is that now that you have access to the database, you have access to the tables, you want to like allow or deny certain kind of things. So you cannot run a select query. You could probably add, even if it does not matter what role you have, there's a separate object, like you can have an entire select statement blocked off from a table. So we did not get much into that, but That's another thing that's there as part of the security of the V12 or Server 2016. So I think that wraps up for today's session. I know this was a little demo heavy and there's a lot going on. I would suggest that you pause your video, go step by step, looking at the slides on how to, follow along and do some of these things on your own. Just remember that this is cloud. I mean, more protection is definitely warranted in every from every angle, really, because people are already skeptical. Hey, I'm putting my database on the cloud. What's happening to it? Well, there's a lot of security mechanisms that are in there to make sure that you're protected. So this is a good, uh, this is this session is good for your production work too, or to even convince someone that it is as secure as it can be. There are a lot of other security things that came with SQL Azure, things like always encryption, always on encryption, um, and database level encryption, storage level encryption. There is also masking of columns. So let's say you're a developer working on an HR database and you want to make sure that even if this person is a developer and needs entire access to the database, we don't want him to look at the salary or social insurance numbers of um, all the employees in that organization. So you have actually a column based masking, so they can still run the query, they can do a select a star, but those columns will be masked. It's a feature from SQL Server 2016, so obviously the version 12 on SQL Azure has that as well. So there are many things like that on the SQL Azure with this version. Anyways, so let's wrap this up. So as you know, my training site is at cloudranger.net/Azure training. You are most likely watching this on YouTube on the Cloud Ranger network. I'll be posting the slides as soon as possible on the slideshare.net. My Twitter handle is at Sean Ismail. Email me if you want to. I'm not being very up to date with my email, so I'm still behind responding all the emails that you have sent. I have read some of them. There are still a lot pending. I'll try to respond them as much as possible, but just to let you know, that's probably not the best way to catch me. You can obviously send comments on the YouTube video. I'm a little bit more quicker in responding to that. Um, you can also connect with me on LinkedIn. I know some of you have, and some of you have definitely sent messages. I got back to some, and there are still some pending over there as well. Thank you for viewing, and please don't forget to like the videos, and your encouragement definitely works in making all these videos happen, right? All right, so till next time, thank you.